Welcome everyone to the third part of this series, which is called The Voice of Philosophy, about an old medium. And last time we talked about universality, or the theme or topic of universality. So of course we just scratched the surface and we didn't get into like the really like the real depth, so to say, and all the profundity of the topic, but we kind of get a first proximal idea, and this was kind of first approach to kind of draft open the topic, so that there is a certain form of universality, and what this can mean or could mean, right? We kind of referred that to the Turing machine, so that there's some kind of machine first as a theoretical postulate by Turing, that there could be like a Turing machine which simulated all kinds of possible Turing machine, and which one then could call, like, due to its versatileness or its versatility, one could call that then a universal Turing machine, because it could like emulate or imitate or simulate, run all kind of possible programs of individual Turing machines or specific Turing machines. So this time I thought about, or what I'm proposing is to make an interlude to a topic, namely the trace. And we will do that because now we had universality, and kind of we get an idea what it could mean, like, right, what a universal discourse could look like. I mean, it's specifically tempting to like associate that with, like, right, mathematical language or mathematics as a way of kind of generating knowledge, right, with ideal objects, or then again with like using certain using certain terms, like operationalizing kinds of not universality but infinity, right, and then again solving problems. I mean, there's a whole lot to discover there, also with regard to geometry, right, so that we kind of we have this in geometry, we have kind of the space of intuition, and then again in regard of algebra, we can like solve for geometrical problems, but with the use of equations. So there is no actual space of intuition, or like we kind of strip off, or like we make superfluous the space of intuition in some sense. Okay, so now we look at the trace as kind of a contrasting foil, I hope, and then we go again into the main line of kind of the bigger argument, or the bigger theme of specifically looking at the voice. But I think this is necessary because there is this there is this kind of this aspect to the voice where it's if we speak out loud, it's pretty clear that there are that we produce certain phonemes and kind of spell out and form words, right, and kind of connect sentences, and there's certain materiality to it, even if it's just the vibration of our kind of sound organ, and then again, like right, the kind of the reverberations that are kind of transduced or kind of mediated by air molecules, right, and they're brought into vibration, and then we have kind of a mechanism, or like a certain organ, a certain function where we can kind of sense these reverberations or vibrations or waves sound waves. Okay, so and then again, right, when we read something, or when we stay into like in the form of a monologue, when we think also, this aspect, like producing phonemes, seems to fall away, and there we come pretty easily to the question of the materiality. So is there a materiality to the voice, not only to the voice as sounded out, as the voice that fills a room, or that kind of captures also a room and produces a sound atmosphere, and the voice of writing and reading, right? The voice of kind of our inner monologue, if you want so, and kind of the difference between them. Okay, so now we go into the topic. So kind of the space of intuition that I want to provide is, you see a dog, right? And the dog is, just imagine it like it's framed there, it's standing there in a room, and the dog is kind of the reference object where we all the examples I make, they will relate to the dog, for example, or to the traces. So there is on the right side, there's a trace of an animal, a footprint in kind of the sand, mud, and then there are traces of, for example, in the middle, of human feet, right? It seems like there's someone tapped into a painting color, and then tapped over the screen or over the surface, and left behind those traces. And these are also like reference objects. And now the question becomes, also for Derrida, that is like he's a great or like a big trace theoretician, but not only him. It's like also when you go into someone like Freud or Heidegger, the trace will be really important in some aspects or another. And so these all will be like our reference objects, okay? So if you usually say that there is the trace of a dog, or a trace of a dog, and so if we usually say that, and we say, or what we say is that there was a dog, right? So the dog is not standing there anymore, for example, but we point to the trace. And then you or we probably ask ourselves what it is supposed to mean, right? So the problem we run into is that the real referent is not the dog anymore, not the dog standing there in the room, because it's not there. It was there, and we kind of make the inference, and we kind of use causal reasoning to make this inference and to make this assumption. But the trace only says that the dog should have been there. But you don't have the dog. But if you don't have the dog, you can point to and say, my linguistic sign, so the signifier that I use, refers to the dog. But what you have is to say, my linguistic sign, my discourse, my linguistic sign or my discourse refers to the trace. And then you have to say, what is the trace, right? What is the trace in itself? Or not in itself, but perhaps not in itself, but what is the trace? So for us, first of all. Well, the trace is actually the linguistic sign of an absence, one could say, right? It's the presence of an absence. So we have the trace we can point to, but it's really like it stands for something else, right? For something that is absent. At least that is what we are inferring or reading into it. So so it's just a sign that there was a dog, to rephrase that. And the trace is not a body, right? It's not an object, but it is only an outline, a contour, a negative impression or imprint. So itself only an outline of this absence. So we then come to what is actually the content of this trace itself. So what is the content of the trace itself? Now, there's itself. If the dog is there, you refer to a thing, right? And then you must already be like radically anti-positivist or anti-empiricalist. So renouncing that that there is not the thing of which we can say for us all that, right, there's a dog standing there. So that is that this is the trace as the dog is there, right? So for example, if the dog is standing on the ground and you see like I don't know, the sand or the mud is like kind of disfigurated or kind of displaced a little bit, and you know, the surface is kind of touched, so to say. And the dog is really standing there, right? We have to kind of to leave all notions of positivism, so that there is something positive we can you know, we can measure and we can observe it, and so we can ask other people if the dog is standing there. We can I don't know, kind of measure the heat waves with a special camera, and so on. Make a photograph, right? So these are all ways to kind of positivistically and empirically kind of prove or infer that there is a dog. So if we were a radical epistemologist, we would say that the dog standing in the room is actually not the dog. It's actually not the dog we're referring to. Let's assume this is a kind of basic positivism that we can agree on. So, right, because when you use the word dog, it's kind of a word that or a concept, a notion or a concept that you use, and now the question becomes, how could you like right? So you use like a general notion or a notion that refers to many instances of dogs. How can you really pinpoint the specific dog or the particular dog that you're pointing to? So we kind of assume that basic positivism here, right? One can of course question this, then you would be like into a question of epistemology, about question of how we can know things, how to recognize a certain object, what we actually do with the object, or what is necessary to do, or what needs to be active or passively done, so that we can recognize, right, anything at all. Okay, so but we assume that, and so there's a dog standing there in the room. We can kind of commit ourselves to that, like subjectively, and then we could agree on there's a dog standing there in quotation marks, right? This is kind of the proposition that we can agree upon. Now the trace and the whole topic of the trace shakes the whole thing up, the whole matter of sake, because you can't just say there is the trace, and from this moment, in terms of reconstruction and construction of the trace, you know, we could then all agree upon that there is, for example, a dog, right? Because like when we just have the trace, in case, right, take the trace as it's like an imprint in the sand, and the footprint. So we need to make this this inference and kind of use causal reasoning to come up with this inference. Okay, so now you could make the claim that the whole reconstruction, construction aspect of trace reading and of using inference chains, you know, could all go over into a performative moment, a moment of action or event, right, where we kind of develop a narration in which this specific trace, for example, in the sand, the right on the screen, is then integrated or interwoven into, or due to the reading of the trace, is integrated or woven into by or due to the reading of the trace. So it's kind of you know, getting evoked in terms of our narration, first of all, and then we have special narration with special you know, kind of reasoning to it, and we could call that causality. Like this would be one position one could take, and the problem that arises is that of materiality, specifically, because if that were the case, there would be no trace in itself or for itself. But there would only be the performative occasioning, if one takes this extreme position, performative occasioning that results from a certain marking. When you think of an actual trace of a dog, or you think of a paw impression, you know, you can do that, but that is also an ideal typical trace. So now what if the paw is cut in half, or you have a small unevenness on the forest floor and you cannot exactly say, is this a trace now or not? So the kind of the problem is that the border, or like the boundary is can be gradually can be gradually withdrawing, or can be gradually being smudged, and so there is a question if there is such a thing as a boundary, as a contour, a gestalt that you can pinpoint, or that you can refer to. And you can push that so far that it becomes unclear what is actually still a trace and what is not a trace. So when you go into the forest in search of tracks, right, you don't find the tracks as such normally, or usually, how you find the dog or the stone, right? So you have to look for them, and you have to to sort out, is this a trace or not? You have to look for indications, for indices, and so it's a real problem that we pass over in the everyday context normally. So we find in the forest only what looks much or less like a track or a trace, in a sense. So that's a problem for epistemology, first of all, but it becomes a problem also for, a bigger problem, at least if we kind of go with it, and don't let us directly, cry out. So what Derrida is doing there. So doesn't it actually go so far, or could one not go so far as to say whether a track exists at all independently of the track reader? So one can present, right? One can present represent the track ideally in a hunter's handbook. So you get it presented, but actually it's a representation of an ideal, footprint of an animal, or ideal track. But as soon as the forest floor is frozen, or as soon as you have real circumstances kicking in, the whole thing complicates. So and we would probably usually say that it then becomes more complicated to read these tracks and to make them unambiguous. So depending on experience, right, there might be people that are more experienced in it, but all this presupposes that there is still a track there that you can refer to, and that you can that someone can read, and not only in terms of the question if even by an experienced track reader, what is he doing there, what is he reading there, and what he's referring to, so that one cannot. So can one push that so far that one cannot even say anymore of a pure moment? There's a bump in the ground, that there's no objective difference, so this is a question if one can ask oneself. The trace phenomenon shows that there is so sorry for the interruption. So the trace phenomenon shows that there is a materiality, first of all, of being away. So and this is something else than an objective difference. At least we have to look if that falls together. So there's an absence, and the relation of phenomenon and reality leads to a certain threshold. So phenomenon as something that appears, and you can make a difference in the phenomenon notion. So something that appears, and or what appears as phenomenon, and then what is appearing in the phenomenon. So to make this a little bit clearer, you can also make the distinction in the image. So when I talked about a split image, you can make the distinction between an image object and the image sujet. That was what Edmund Husserl is doing, for example, on a really basic level. So when you look at this image that I show you, it's like, okay, there's an image object, so there's certain kind of pixels and certain, certain areals of color, and but this image object is kind of to be differentiated from the image sujet. So what is shown, right? There is a dog, actually, there is a trace, and there is a certain kind of arrangement of also the symbols trace. So what we see as the sujet, as the topic, or kind of the sense of the image, what we what we see there in terms of its content, its meaning, is something else than kind of the object, the kind of sheer object depiction, or sheer pixel identification. Okay, so there's the same difference, and you can make the same difference in phenomenon. So the appearance of something, so you have the appearance itself, and then something that is appearing, and reality leads to a certain threshold. So the question, of course, or the question, not of course, but the question is, what is the reference between phenomenon and reality? So, right, if you can relate, or how this relation is made up of, let's say like this, to be careful, because it's really complicated. So, okay, if you say there is it, so of something, right? And I ask you, what is there? Then you have to say, in respect of the trace, it is the outline of nothing, actually. It has just no materiality, if you want so. And thus this leads to the question of the phenomenon as something that can be indicated, at least, right? So something that is appearing there must be some possibility to indicate that, even if it's like doesn't have to be like a positive content, but it has to be, you can also indicate something as withdrawing, for example, but nevertheless you need to be able to indicate it. And now the question becomes, if you indicate something as withdrawing and as absent, does that have like a materiality, or something that we would usually call material? Would it stand up to it, right? I mean, the notion of materiality is complicated, and there's not a definition, right? If we go with something that has mass and that kind of is self-standing or self-procuring in a way, so like with a certain kind of persistence and resistance, and it's not dependent on like its recognition solely, so that we don't bring something in existence, in material existence, just by thinking of it. So then you nevertheless have the problem, right, that when you go even in the subatomic or like molecular level, then you kind of find, okay, subatomic particles, and they don't have some of them don't have a mass, and they can, there's also the question in what relation of or in what context they can be pinpointed in time. And so this is like hard to pinpoint. And then you can make the step, okay, it's like you talk about in terms of material objects, you talk about physical objects, which are like not placeholders, but place occupants. So they take in a space and time spot, and kind of then you kind of outgo the problem talking about like gases or like liquids, which also are hard to pinpoint with the notion of like something solid that we perhaps usually first represent to ourselves, something when we think of materiality, something solid, something persistent, something that resists touch, at least in some respect, and so on. Okay, so but it's nevertheless hard, but we can go with this aspect of taking in a a space and time place, and so then you end up with some notion of physical object, or that kind of is in the realm of physical description, so to say. Okay, but nevertheless, if all you can indicate to is something that is not there, that is, I mean, the question is if it's there. This is the big question. But something that is absence, and can you refer to it in what way? Can you refer to it as something And this becomes the problem, also the whole aspect, or like the whole, the spanning width of this notion of the trace. Is there a materiality of phenomenality outside of the context in which the trace is read? This is the question. I read it again. Is there a materiality, a moment of materiality, of phenomenality outside the context in which the trace is read? So if you say there's something persistent, and be it only the difference to the non-persistent or between persistent moments, there's the aspect to it that the difference, or a difference, has already set in, it's inscribed itself. And then from this model, it would also no longer be possible to say there's something persistent, and you have to kind of take this something, that there is something persistent, there is something, and what is the question of reading the trace. So there is something, I mean, we can, this is what we kind of refer to. We have, a negative imprint, or in the case of the foot, a positive imprint, right? We even have like color particles from the guy that stepped into the painting color and then walked across the hallway, and we have even like a positive subparticle or subatomic particles, or even like a phenomenal impression, right, of the trace as it appears, like in its yellow color. There's something about we talk, and in a way in which it appears. But the question nevertheless remains, right? Are we talking about something when we're referring to this? And if we kind of refer to this also in its phenomenal quality, is there a aspect, a moment of materiality to it outside the context in which we read it, outside the trace reader or the track reader? Or is it all dependent on the trace reader, on us as reading the trace, and on us as forming this trace and weave it into our certain kind of narration, be that like a rational, like narration where we can say, it's factual because we rely on a casuistic, or be that like a another kind of narration, a more fictitious one. So okay, so where I have to get back on track now. So because if it weren't the case that there is like a moment in referring to this, phenomenality of the trace, referring to the trace and what we kind of mean by it, if there wasn't like, if there is no difference in the external world to which one could refer with a certain necessity, then there is a certain epistemic problem. One could name it as such, or like first, point it out. And the problem is kind of the question of the materiality of the trace as such, that a certain reading results, a certain activity, right? It's a doing. A reading is a doing, and it results in a turn or a twist. So from the materiality of a trace, as we commonly assume it to the description of the trace as a sign of absence of something. So this is kind of the twist from the materiality of the trace. Okay, there is a materiality to it, and the trace is referring or being the evidence for there being like a deer or a human or a dog, right? So depending on the trace and its kind of form and gestalt and so on. Then the turn or twist is now to the description of the trace as a sign of absence of something. So this is certain kind of pushing from another perspective. And the question is how far we can do that, and kind of, how these positions come to terms with each other. So it is not the trace that says there is something, but only shows us that there has been something. There has been something. There was a being there. And so it's a reference to something absent. And the problem of the reading, so the reading of the trace, is now what is actually read. And what is actually the real referent of what we read there, okay? So, like we can do this, we can do this with another kind of line of argument. So if you say, okay, the trace is kind of marking, right? It's a, a negative marking or a positive marking in that sense that you have a color print, or a negative marking if it's like just some mud or some sand is like kind of pushed towards the outside, so you have a negative imprint. So how is this to be understood or interpreted? So such a marking is part of the interpretation of the one who enters there actively into the trace reading and to make or to set this marking as mark or trace. So the focus is on the as mark, a marking as mark or trace. Whether this is a fact or this is kind of allegedly fact or like an proclaimed fact plays no role. And this kind of really hard to go with, but we should do that to really get the full kind of panorama. So the mark, one could say, is a material moment, right? So you have like the color kind of that you have on the ground because someone stepped there with his foot and before he stepped in a kind of a painting, or you have like the kind of, you can kind of measure, right, how deep the foot track goes into the ground. So in the sense you have a negative material moment or a positive material moment. So material moment from the continuum of all material moments that are surrounding us is taken and transformed into a medium, in that sense that it's mediating us to what is absent but what we proclaim to having been there. And this is made then into a trace. So this is kind of the move. But with that, it is not yet a material moment of the trace itself. So we have a material mark, but it's not a material moment of the trace itself. This is kind of the clue in Derrida's reading. And it's really like an epistemic problem. This is important to point out. So you have a material mark that you read as trace or as track, but then there's a difference between the material moment of the trace and the material mark, and it's so it is some material moment that is read as a trace. So as always, this as structure is the hermeneutical as, so something, understanding something as something, and then you have this aspect of you name something and then you explicate its sense. So you always have this a difference introduced also. So there are material moments that can be put together to form traces. But this means very concretely that a dog or deer track in the forest, for a dog or deer track in the forest, there's nothing about the track itself that says dog or deer. And this would mean, or what one could like deduce from this, is that there is no real presence of the trace of a dog or deer. So that there is no real presence of the trace of a dog or deer. There is only a material presence of something material. A material moment which is made into a trace in terms of the trace reading. So it's kind of a mind twisting, but nevertheless it gets to a point, I guess. So that the receiver makes, another way is to paraphrase that, hopefully to better understand it, that the receiver makes himself the receiver of a message. This kind of Derrida's position. So the receiver makes himself the receiver of a message. He makes himself the receiver of a message. This is important, which he himself must also, or she herself must also produce, but which is nevertheless not his own. And this is kind of it seems paradoxical. So which she herself must also produce the message and receive, but which is nevertheless not her own. So one nevertheless brings the trace to oneself, or brings it about as something foreign, which would be something else again than an intentional own message. And this is what becomes difficult to keep apart. So one has to say that Derrida is critiquing a certain kind of philosophical or a kind of philosophical movement, namely phenomenology, and he is doing that by using the exact method of phenomenology itself. So he is critiquing phenomenology from inside phenomenology. This is important, and it's kind of really important. So whether the present whether the presence in German it's Vergegenwärtigen, whether so we talk about when we see or perceive something and kind of recognize it. We talk in German about Vergegenwärtigen, to make something present to ourselves in terms of bringing it in front of our inner eyes, or like guiding our attention to it. So whether this making present is, or perhaps I don't if it's representing, but this making present, or bringing before one's mind or before one's inner eye, and so in this sense, whether this making present is the marking, one would have to ask or discuss whether this is really the material marking that one wants to refer to, but that is like appearing phenomenological. So what Husserl is doing in phenomenology on a really basic level, to describe it, is that he's like, he calls it epoche. So he's bracketing our everyday belief or kind of assumption in what he calls Seinsgeltung, what counts as being, as existent, what counts as real in that sense, as real existence, or as actual existence. So he's bracketing that in, and he's concentrating totally on this difference in the phenomenological appearing, or in the phenomenal appearing. Like, right, and what I want to recall is the difference in the word phenomenon itself. So it's the appearing and what is appearing. So the image, or the image sujet, or the image object. There's always this difference. It's in ambivalence, and this is the whole point of kind of Derrida's reading, or one especially important point. So and Husserl is claiming to be able to make this bracketing, because if you have like an object of recognition, so if you talk about a representation or something that is represented to the mind, that is made present in terms of bringing it before the mind, before the inner eye, then you also, and you have like an object that you can refer to, like for example, a mental object, then you also must, or implicitly set like a subject, or he calls that an ego in the sense a transcendental ego, like the condition of possibility for this making present and bringing before the mind. Then is that you also set, or like setzen, set, or you also posit or suppose an ego, and he calls it ein reines ego. So it's also with Kant you have the critique of pure reason, so it's a pure ego, and so it's not in a sense not observable, it's like transcendental, it's a condition of possibility, and he wants to, from this stance, so to say, he wants to kind of describe and depict in terms of phenomenological, so logical but phenomenological methods. He wants to describe and depict and kind of sort out the difference in the appearance. So the difference between the appearance as such and what is appearing. And this is then the assumption that there is like a sense layer, so to say, that we are dipped into, like pre-expressively, pre-notionally, and that we kind of can press out of this intentional relation, so intentional being related always to an object. So, for example, a mental object, even if it's not clear what this means, but that the kind of the claim is, or the argument is, that consciousness comes from Brentano, that consciousness is always consciousness of something, and self-consciousness is then being conscious of that relation and referring to something, and then also being conscious that one makes up this relation, and that one has this experience, this specific experience, for example. So there's another kind of reflective layer to it. Okay, but nevertheless, so I moved up the way, but so the point is, yeah, exactly, with the making present of the marking. So the marking is, in terms of Derrida now, who's like critiquing phenomenology from inside phenomenology, the marking is studied in terms of its phenomenological appearing. So it's bracketed whether the mark exists, independently of the phenomenological appearing. So how this mark is appearing to us on the screen, for example, right? We would say, okay, it's a image on the screen, so it's on the right side. Okay, it's a photograph. It's like an indexical relation in terms of peers. So there might be we kind of would infer or kind of make this indexical relation that there was really such a trace if the photo is not manipulated, and that this photograph is an index of that trace on the ground. But in terms of the depiction in the middle right, we would say, okay, this is like a fictitious image. It's like a symbol and an icon. An icon in the sense that it kind of resembles our foot mark, and it's not, it's an icon. It's in the sense not directly more an icon than symbol, because symbol, it would be just a convention, but we actually can relate to that as kind of mimicking, or kind of being isomorphic to our own footprints in some sense, in an iconic sense. Okay, so whether the present is the mark, whether the making present is, or whether the now I have to sort it myself out, whether the making present is the marking, and whether that we can this or kind of determine if this marking is, if it, or we would first have to ask, first of all, the presentness for consciousness, for being aware of it, for having this phenomenological appearing character to it, that we can speak about it in the way that it presents itself, or that it shows up, that it shines forth, that it and not just as it's just an appearance, or but so this is kind of the what we have in Kant, that he's talking about the realm of appearances as, okay, what is appearing to us, and is distinguished to the thing as it is in itself, not as it's just appearing to us, due to our perceptive capabilities and sensual and reason faculty faculty properties, or our capacity for recognition, let's say it like this. But for Husserl, he's bracketing that, and then there is like the distinction is not between an appearance and the thing in itself, but we now focus on the difference in the appearing, in the phenomena itself. So between the appearance, character or aspect, and between what is appearing. So, and now we first of all would have to ask if the presentness in terms of this phenomena is the realization that there has been a dog. So this is important, and this is the question whether what is present, what we present to our mind, or what we get presented in terms of our mind. I mean, it seems to be kind of, I mean, this question if there are two sides to it. So if this is the realization that there has been a dog, and if we can kind of depict or kind of sort out and argue for a moment of, material independence of this realization. So, right, because the trace shows, so to speak, first of all, the absent presence of the animal. That is, first of all, the realization. First of all, the realization of an absence, and then the question becomes whether the presentness is then attached to the trace or to the material moment. And this is yet another question, but this is kind of the clue. If the presentness as how it is appearing, this mark, in the way it is appearing, so that we have this phenomena of the mark, and there seems to be something showing up, something appearing, right, which we call a mark. But now it's the question if we just if this is a realization that the dog, for example, has been there, or if we just, so that would be like a material independent moment, or we just attach that to the trace from like an immanent position of phenomenological appearing, right, like kind of position of consciousness. This time question is in there, and or like make a description in there. So this having been there, and or the realization that there really has been a dog, this kind of the time aspect to it. And the plausibility also, if I say, that's a dinosaur, for example, we could also think of that, a trace of or track of a dinosaur, then I probably can't make a plausible narrative out of it. That there was a dinosaur 2 days ago, but it's just also therein that the whole burden of proof of the trace gives or like shifts on the side of the trace reader if we push it to that limit. And so there's no, that if we push it that far and kind of resist on it, or kind of go with the argument, then one could argue that there is no material evidence where one can really say and pinpoint that in this, or that there's a material moment, that there would be a beginning something of a trace, like a kind of a specifiable outline of what then we can call trace independent of the trace reading, on write something like an irrefutable moment of a specific trace that is what is completely taken out in this reading, or in this argumentation, line of argumentation. Is pushing, it's really pushing. It's kind of looking what happens when one does it, when one follows it. This leads to the fact that in a very radical sense, it has to be said that what is read in the trace, according to this position, is also read into it, and does not read out of it, but builds a plausible narrative around a moment. But the important point is that, and I want to stress that the materiality of this trace is not outside the narrative then, i.e. there is ultimately no material trace. It doesn't exist at all. And this is kind of where Derrida comes out, I think, as at one point. And now the theory of the trace definitely includes real examples of the trace, and this is good, so right? So concrete example, as we have on concrete in the sense, like as we kind of would witness it or observe it in the forest. So whether this whole reading or argumentation is then really true is, like, of course, the big question. That doesn't, but yeah, what is kind of the point when kind of that holds true, or when this argument has some kind of validity to it, then one would end in a position where one would have to say, if there was really a trace, if there was truly an animal, that doesn't matter then, because, right, this position would be or the burden of proof would be on the side of the trace reader, and we would come to a limit situation, kind of, where we couldn't say if that is really the case, really, if we can know it, certainly, and universally speak about traces, so to say, in a definite sense. One has to realize that this then also applies to whole real traces in the forest floor. The trace is something like a material inscription of an absence, a gap, i.e. the trace actually defined by an inscription, a gap. And this is what this is based on, this kind of reading. It's kind of a spun to the point that it boils down to the immateriality of the trace as such. And the conclusion that this ultimately leads to, that the narrative decides whether there was a trace or there wasn't a trace, and thus a certain reality or materiality of what lies outside of this narrative is annulled. The very practical question that arises: what happens if we come to different opinions concerning a trace, and one comes to different views? How is it then actually possible to come to a statement about this trace and kind of figure out how they fit together, how we should decide? Okay, so then one aspect to it in terms of psychoanalysis and Freud, okay, because something I think is important here, that Freud is not arguing in a vacuum in terms of traces, in terms of psychoanalysis. So because here it is about real things, that would be the claim. I mean, I just propose it that this is the position. And in the end, it means that what is read in the trace it becomes the question what is read in the trace, right? So in terms of Freud, one could say, okay, he's also like doing trace reading, and now the kind of critique would be, okay, he's just doing trace reading, he's just weaving, it's exactly this position, he's just weaving different moments into a narrative, right, and bind them together and make them up certain concepts. Okay, but that this does not encounter any material concreteness, which would have there an objective force of proof, for example. One could only say there's a certain plausibility of narrative, which one then somehow compares among themselves. So this would be like a psycho-cultural reading, which is completely wrong. But there's more. But there would be no more objectivity of this trace in a psychoanalytic sense of any kind. That there's also first of all a kind of marking in the case. Right, in terms of psychoanalysis, for example, a trace could be the marking in the case of a misperformance. So, I stutter, for example, or I have a slip of the tongue, or I forget a name. So something that punches a hole, something that makes my voice stutter or completely shut down, so to say, kind of break down in the conscious context or in the conscious aspect of speech, like an interruption, a cut. And there one could also say it is about a kind of trace, or Freud is kind of depicting or kind of reading a kind of trace. It's the gap, the interruption, whose impression, first of all, itself contains nothing material, right? It's a negative, it's a gap. And there's the question, or the question would be exactly whether there's not the same thing taking place, whether Freud is not a trace reader who first constitutes this trace and also only creates it in the radical sense. So constructivist position that he just constructs this, only allows this marking to become a trace. This marking, he reads this marking as a trace, and he reads into this marking a trace. A difficult that psychoanalysis is always accused of, right, isn't what Freud is doing, developing a narration where you really can prove that this is real narration. Is there any material sign what Freud is developing, or that in the end perhaps only Freud's explanations or his theory is plausible narration, which pushes moments into each other, which make makes two moments of, or which it makes moments of a trace and let become a story. Kind of this some reading of Freud, of kind of a critical reading, but I think it's not setting itself apart and kind of not working hard enough with Freud, I guess. That would be like at least an assumption. So Freud would argue that there are moments that are provable independently. So now in defense of Freud, there are moments that are provable independently of him, but ultimately the moments that are raised are interruptions or absences. So think of like my voice breaks down, or I have stuttering in my voice suddenly, or I forget something. So also something like forgetting. How does one really want to prove why a name was forgotten? Is there any material proof of that? Freud's argument boils down to the fact that what is going on there is not only the shape of his own narrative unfolding of plausible narration for the reason that expresses itself independently, again in another place. This is der andere Schauplatz, the other place of occasioning, of occurring. And there the evidence of the external world comes into play. It is not only about this one promise and what is expressed in this promise and what Freud now brings together into story. The same is found in other places. There is namely a materiality of the trace in terms of psychoanalysis with Freud. Even if one now rejects my narration in terms of arguing for, in terms of, on the side of Freud, with regard to the trace, there's nothing material about it, right? It could be the claim or the suspicion. But nevertheless, one could make the argument from out of the position of Freud that there is nevertheless an objectivity to it. Remember, he's studying radical singular case studies, but he's having this pinch into the empirical. So he's studying. He kind of, people come to him, right? They come into his sessions, and then they do psychoanalytic theory, what he's developing, and they are all case studies now. And in these terms of these cases and his patient, there are certain symptoms like constellation show up at different places, at different location, and in a certain rhythm, a certain tact, a certain frequency of repetitions. And that doesn't just disappear. That exists, that is there. And doesn't say that's, or one could perhaps, that doesn't say that's an objective scientifically tangible phenomenon, but Freud would say there's a materiality of the trace in psychoanalysis which develops through the repetition, but that's a very difficult difference to unfold, because you wouldn't be able to, make that into a general law or a kind of universality that kind of scientific discourse pushes for, or kind of must commit to, that you have you presuppose a kind of universality in terms of you make up a theory and then you sort the individual cases underneath and refer them back to the whole or to the universal, so to say. But in terms of Freud, it's like he's observing the symptoms in different singular cases, case studies, and this is and he can make up certain constellation and certain nexus, a certain kind of systematicity, but in a really light sense, so to say. Of course, one has to argue that fully out, but just to give you a first impression. And but so you have a form of generality, but it isn't a form of universality, but it's nevertheless a form of generality, but it's just hanging together by the frequency and the rhythm of repetitions of symptomatic outbreaks or symptomatic occurrences, which show themselves as cuts, as gaps, as negative inscriptions, so that there is no unconditional absolute material object for the phenomenon we are investigating, but there is something brought forth that is different from what it points to. The question of the sign that points to a disease or the like. So a sign always has this double character. And this is also important in terms of Derrida, right? You have the signifier and the signified. Now, You would also have that in Freud, that you have the symptom and what the symptom kind of points to. For Lacan, another psychoanalytic philosopher that is reading Freud, the distinction between man and animal is precisely that man is capable of falsely laying false traces. So we will go into that, but this is just a kind of trajectory where this is going. The capability of falsely laying false traces. So think of you playing poker, and you have like a hand of cards, and you have like a full house, and now you say to your opponents, yeah, I have a full house. Okay, so that would be laying a false trace according to Lacan, and only this would be the distinguishing mark between man and animal. So because animals, they would be able to pee in their environment and kind of pretend that they're actually spatial extension of their body is far bigger, or they mark the territory in this sense, and that is far bigger as their corpus, their corporeal aspect is, their body is. But that would be like a false trace. But now there comes the double negation. Kind of the falsely false trace would be where you have the full house. You say you have the full house, but what happens, right, to your opponents is he asks himself or herself, does he really have the full house, or does she really have the full house? So there's a kind of uncertainty, and Lacan brings this together with Descartes and the absolute or radical doubt, but we will see that. So traces are not intended, but are unmotivated. Remains, leaves, leftovers, residues. How can I actually know that these are brought together into a real trace and not merely invented, for example? So difference between leaving traces and reading traces, this was what we are talking about. The receiver, as it were, first creates the message that would be one reading from the legacies, which she then receives. Then this would mean that the act of tracing is only the constitution of this trace, and the trace before that is only something like the accumulation of remains. So what Derrida is saying, the trace in itself is polysemous. We will have to look what that means. There's no, it's not definite. One could say that it's not definite in sense. So the sense is exploded, is not easily brought in place and kept in place, like fixed. The meaning is not easily fixed because Derrida will say that there is no transcendental signified. There is not this dimension of sense that Husserl is after. But we will go into that. Moment of making, we have a moment of making visible, which is always in relation to the perception and interpretation of the trace reader. To let this moment of bridging trace and trace reader become something meaningful. This is kind of, what Derrida will kind of look in. What is kind of the movement in between this bridging between trace and trace reader, because the trace is also what happens in the trace, also something that comes foreign to us. This is what Derrida alludes to. The trace is dependent for its meaning on the contexts with which it is read. This is kind of an outline of the trace, and hopefully this will help up with the excursion into universality in the further discussion of the series. So thank you very much, and until next time.